Yeah, so the title is How Weather Affects Lakes. I have a little subtitle that says, and how we can help lakes be resilient. So I want to tie it back a little bit because we can't control the weather, right? Not in the day-to-day. So what can we do actually about whatever the weather can do to our lake? What can we do about it? Can we help the lake somehow be more resistant or more resilient to all these changes in weather that we are experiencing? So I'll always have a little note on that, and we'll get right into it.
Oh, sorry to cut in here, but I forgot to mention as part of our intro to everybody who would like to make comments or have any questions, feel free to use, if you look on the very bottom of your screen, you should see the ability to chat. So please use that chat box and I'll be monitoring that. And then we'll take sort of breaks from time to time and we will use that to make sure that we can ask our questions when they're on our mind and we won't forget about them.
Yeah, welcome back. You know, it's not just the one way here. I would really like to hear from you as well, what you're experiencing in weather and how it affects your use of a lake, and if you have any questions around that. So so the first slide here is on what is how we define weather. We hear a lot of discussions about weather and climate, and is it one or the other? So I wanted to go a little bit into definitions that in the scientific world we use, so I have highlighted here a little bit the comparison in the middle between weather and climate. So weather is really what's going on short term. So it's the day-to-day. Today it's raining. Yesterday was nice. It's really quite what we talk about on a short term. Like one thing that Albertans I think really like to do is look at the radar. It's actually something I got to learn here. I'm not from here, and I was always wondering what people were talking about the radar, but I can understand it now because the weather changes so quickly. It's a good place to go. Now, the climate is more something that is going on over a long time period, and also kind of in a larger region. Like we use it as a word, like climate change is of course a big buzzword. I'll get back into that later. And how we really define it, let's say here for Alberta, is we have these climate zones. There's different classifications, but the really classic one is the Köppen climate types. And we have here the subarctic type, like the dark green ones, quite large areas, which kind of correspond a little bit to the foothills and the boreal forest areas. And then we have a blue one as well, warm summer, humid continental, which is more like the parkland, where we have more like poplar forests mixed in with some grassland. And then the cold, the yellow in the corner here is the semi-arid, the south, the prairies, it's really dry. So that's a different type of climate, right? So this is how we just define climate in the science world. And I want to talk a little bit about both today. Of course, I'm gonna focus on weather, which is what we are experiencing, but I'll link it sometimes to the climate patterns as well as we see. So here the next slide then gets a little bit more into detail on that. So we do have both weather and climate, right? So the weather is really kind of superimposed on climate. When you look at this graph here, this is the temperature record. So it's the spring temperatures for every year since 1948 until 2020, something that you get of Environment Canada website. And you can see that there is a trend, like a long-term trend in this climate. So we see like in general overall warming in spring temperatures. But when you can see how it's wiggly, right? It's going up and down and up and down. So the weather really changes from year to year. So for example, spring 2020, when you look at the number, like where it goes across there, it's quite low. It's around actually the 0 degrees Celsius average temperatures, right? And then you compare that to earlier, it's for example 1949 here, it was actually 0.2 or something. So even though we have this long-term climate increasing trend, this year was actually colder than in 1994. So it's a really good thing to know about weather. Because often we just look at the weather and say, oh, where's the climate change, or what's going on. There's really just a lot of variation, right? And in the day-to-day, we can't see the climate, we only see the weather. And I guess one interesting piece here, I'm not sure how, I don't want to go too much into detail because there's all kinds of science around it, but there's also climate cycles, and we'll see this a little later. So there's longer periods of time that are drier, and then others that are wetter again. So it might be like 20 years or something. So one of these cycles is called Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and there's lots of talk, and it's quite unsure still if what we're seeing right now is a new wet cycle or not. So scientists will, I don't know when they will determine it, but it's always it takes a while. Only in hindcast people can see. They never exactly know when the next oscillation will come. So we'll talk about that a little later, but it's all part of a big picture, I guess. And today I want to talk about different kinds of weather. And I encourage you to ask me maybe about different things that you might be interested in. So maybe at the end we can go through other things. What I want to talk about today, of course, it's the rain. What's rainy weather doing to the lake? Because that's what we've seen, and you can probably talk about some of experiences. What is drought doing to a lake? Sunny and warm weather, what is happening then? What's happening when it's windy? What's happening when it's cold and when we have snow? And then I want to, to the end, I want to look at what we can find maybe in the future, what scientists predict in the future, how climate will change, and then I'll talk a little bit how that can affect lakes. It's yeah. So these are the topics. It's kind of a little bit my outline, and we'll have like a little break after rainy. We have a break after sunny and warm, and then a break after frost and snow. So we'll have 3 breaks, and then of course at the end also an opportunity to talk. And on the right, actually, maybe I want to quickly tell you about this graph here. So this graph is a water balance, and really weather affects both the water balance. Water balance, of course, is mostly affected by rain and droughts and also snow. So you can see here PPT is precipitation, and when we inflow from a watershed, of course, also coming from the rain. We have also the water over the years, it goes into the groundwater and eventually makes it to a lake. And then we have evaporation, where we lose water. And these are all related to weather, right? So if we have more rain, we get more water, but if it's warm, we also lose more water through evaporation. So there's 2 mechanisms working at the same time. And kind of a similar thing is also with the energy balance. When you have a lot of sun, you have a lot of heat coming in. So I didn't put a thing up here, but that's always very important for lakes, how we act, and I'll get to that later. Okay, rain. Of course, the first quite obvious result of more rain is increased lake levels. So it will be good maybe to go do a round call later. I would be interested about Skeleton Lake as well. I only looked at Lac La Biche, and I'll show you one in a minute. Of course, if there's lots of rain, especially 2 years in a row, right? Last year was already a wet year. The groundwater resource, groundwater is probably filling up, and we have more surface water. So as lake levels increase, we see that everywhere. What it also does is that water flushes more quickly into the lake and goes out more quickly, which means the time the water spends actually in the lake is reduced, which has some implications for algae growth and such, and nutrients. But also because we have more rain coming in from a watershed, it can increase the amount of nutrients coming from a watershed into the lake. So these are the substances that algae grow on. So it can be a reason for algae blooms. On that note, of course, this is like a wild guess, but I just told Michael, I saw on the news today that there were 3 dogs who died from algae blooms at Moose Lake quite recently. And, we didn't have that really warm, hot weather, but in this case, it might have been because of the rain, right? That there's lots of nutrients going in the lake. It makes the algae grow. So here is an example that you see in the picture, that you can also have slumping happening on lake sites, right? If you have lake level increasing, shorelines can erode and slump. I picked intentionally a highly modified shoreline here. You know, there's not much vegetation, so it's very susceptible to these kinds of damages, right? You'll lose some shoreline. I'll get to that later. So this is Lac La Biche. I just pulled that up today, and this is actually shown. So the green line is the water level in Lac La Biche. The upper blue line is the historical maximum, so from all the data recorded, which I don't remember now how far they go back, but they usually go back a few decades. I'll have to check that. And then the minimum is on the bottom. So you can see on the, so this record I started in March just to see how this year, in March 2019, just to see how the 2 red years changed the water level. So you can see in early 2019 on the left, the green is kind of almost in the middle between min and max. So it's kind of average lake level. And then you can see that with the spring and summer here last year, lake levels went up a little bit. And then over winter, we went a little bit down. But then, as usual, you can see like it's just a seasonal occurrence. But now with all the rain we've had, we're really close to a historical maximum. So it's quite extreme. It's not higher than, like, it's not highest in history, but it's very close what it's been. So it's kind of an interesting fact to see how actually the weather that we see is influencing the lake. So what can we do to protect the lake from these occurrences? I mean, there's a lot of natural variability of course in there. There's nothing, as I said, we can do about the precipitation. But how can we prevent this erosion and the slumping, right? How can we make sure that the lake can withstand these changes and you know doesn't occur, doesn't get any damage? So there's a few things. Vegetated buffers, so vegetated shorelines and riverbanks are really important. For shorelines, of course, to minimize the damage of slumping and erosion. I'm putting riverbanks in here because in the watershed, that's where the water is coming from, right? So the more vegetation we have on all the rivers in the landscape, the more the water is being filtered and being actually going into the ground instead of running just off over the surface and going directly in the river and back to the lake. So this is something that has to do where watershed management comes in, right? Same thing about wetlands. Wetlands are really, really important in managing water on the landscape and being a buffer. They're like a sponge. So really when it's wet, we're soaking it all up. And when it's drying, then we will release some of it. So these are really important functions in the watershed. What I mentioned earlier, you can get algae blooms because there's more nutrients being washed into the lake. Anything that's in the watershed, you know, with all this rain, it's all gonna get very easily mobilized. So one thing that we can do as lake shore owners is to minimize or just eliminate fertilizer use. Just a little piece that we can do. Of course, there's also agricultural practices to reduce nutrients. There's a lot of things. I'm not going to go into that. I do believe Nathan is going to talk about eutrophication, which is nutrient enrichment. So I'm sure he's going to be talking more about these kinds of topics. And yeah, and infiltrate water, not just up in the watershed, also just around the lake and land development, right? So if you have, you know, a big driveway and it's all paved, the water will run off of the surface and will accelerate, and there's a larger chance of it's going to a lake. Whereas if you have, let's say, a gravel driveway or anything that's more pervious, the water will more easily infiltrate and it'll not get right into the lake, right? So the same thing is with catching water in rain barrels, rain gardens, in ditches. So these are development practices that people can do on their own lands, but also, of course, municipalities can encourage or do in their own on their own land, right? Municipal lands. So yeah, these are little pieces. I know the watershed is huge, and when you do a little thing on your little lot, it may seem it won't make a difference. Which is, of course, you can't visibly see it, but I always think, you know, lots of little actions will, in the big picture, make a difference. So here we go, questions on rain. If anybody has questions, I will ask Daniel if he has also high water levels in Skeleton Lake. I'll just be curious.
Yeah, that's affirmative. We are reaching what's probably coming close to the average long-term elevation of the lake, finally coming back from about a 25-year loss and an endangered low level of water. It's just hang on a second here. I'm showing you a picture of the shoreline.
Mm-hmm.
Getting that. You can see a little fire pit right down here.
Mm-hmm.
You see where the water level is because we're at a very shallow slope here.
Mm-hmm.
That level is about 8 feet from the foot of the fire pit. You can see where the vegetation line is out there in the riparian zone.
Yeah.
And the water level was beyond that at the beginning of last season. 2 seasons now of rain and a great deal of effort, I must say, on the part of a stewardship association here that have worked extremely hard to do every last little thing to clear culverts, to change elevation of culverts, to try to mitigate what had been done through years and years of overdevelopment in the acreage areas here. Finally, every little thing, as you said before, every little effort has paid off, and there's still men standing in the fens and the bogs and in the culverts every 2 days in waders with pitchforks, clearing away vegetation and allowing stuff to finally run back into the basin that had been held back in the fens and bogs and rediverted into another watershed, because there's a continental divide immediately behind me here, 500 meters away.
I heard about that.
We have suffered hard because we have a basin-fed lake, top of the river system, and it's only about 1.5 times the size of the surface area of the lake, and that's all we get. So credits to them, credits to people in doing the research, and to all of the efforts and the funds they've raised in terms of trying to discover what the problem was, and finally getting us the water that we actually deserve. We're about 1.5 feet away from average elevation, and we're hoping for the best.
Thank you. That's really great. I'm loving this.
You know, one question we often get from people is, and perhaps you'll be addressing this later, but and if so, just let me know. But when we have larger amounts of rain, I've heard some people say they think, oh, it's more sedimentation is going to be coming into the lake. Therefore, it's going to be higher nutrients. Therefore, we can expect more algal blooms when there's been lots of rain. And other people I've heard say, well, that's not really the case. It's more that more rain will cause more dilution. And so we'll have fewer algal blooms and less nutrients in the lake. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I actually have a slide on that later. Can we park that?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
It's not an easy answer. Is the answer? It depends on the lake, really. So I'll get to it. It's actually quite at the end of the presentation. But yeah, thanks. Good question. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Mention a couple of comments. Just a lot of what I would have to say reinforces so much of what you presented. We've had high rainfalls here. The lake levels have been noticeably coming up. We can see that along the shorelines. There's places where I go for a walk and there's a bridge that is between a wetland and the lake, and now the lake is spilling back into that wetland. It's filling that wetland up. There's been places where culverts haven't been able to handle the water, and so they've been overrun or washed out. Mike, have you been to Sunset Bay? That little loop road down at Sunset Bay, it's totally washed out, and it's about a 3 or 4 foot gap over top of the culvert that was there. And then what you were saying about wetlands, yeah, well, I sort of mentioned that already there. I think you know Bob Cameron, and I was on a call with him not too long ago, and he's up in the Peace Country, and he said, in the 50 kilometers between where I live, which is DeBolt, he said, and Peace River, he said, all the sponges are full. It's so noticeable.
That's great. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else? We'll move on. So drought, this gets us a little bit into the, the opposite direction. So this is something like the definition is really a long period of a moisture deficit, because drought really comes with two factors. When there is less rain, but it's also warmer. Both kind of go hand in hand. And what it does here, I have this figure, and it's like a scientific index that tries to combine these two things, like the precipitation, so the rain, and the temperature. So the precipitation is the indicator for moisture, and the evaporation is the high temperatures that will lead to the evaporation, so to the loss of water, as I showed earlier in the water balance. And here we see a graph of this for the Athabasca River Basin. So it's called SP, this index, but it really shows when it's blue, there's more water gained than lost, and if it's red, then there's more losses in water. So we can see here quite clearly that there's cycles. You have earlier in the 20th century it was more wet, and then we had the dry period, the Dust Bowl, quite obviously there in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And then we had, some wetter weather in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, when we actually started a lot of measuring. It started to go down again, and we had really dry weather, especially in the 2000s. That's where we had really low, like low moisture, so more drought types conditions where lake levels went down. And in Skeleton Lake, it's probably not the only one. I'll show some pictures shortly. Pigeon Lake was the same thing. People were very concerned about it, but now the data over here, of course, we stopped in 2012 or something. Now the levels come back up because moisture is coming back. So there is cycles in the climate, although superimposed on this long term is a trend of decreasing moisture in this case. So which might change. I'll talk about that a little later in terms of climate change predictions. So yeah, we have the results are reduced lake levels, right? It's just the opposite of a lot of rain. You can have dry docks, like Daniel said. Other actually effects on the lake is also when it's shallower and warmer, especially when it's shallower, you can get more mixing of nutrients from the sediments, which can fuel algae. You can also have a larger zone where aquatic plants grow. So I could imagine, I think that happened in other lakes. When the lake levels go down, of course, then the shallow areas go more out, so the aquatic plants, so it impedes more navigation with boats and such. Another thing is the water residence time I talked about earlier. When it's rainy, it's short, and when it's drought, it's much longer. So the water stays there, and it's just nutrients and algae are just recycled and recycled. So it can be creating more algae. What it means also is that you have less nutrients coming from the watershed, right? That's the opposite factor in terms of when you talk about algae. There's less nutrients coming in from the algae and from the watershed, I mean. So it is a complex system when you talk about what droughts and what more rainy conditions do to lakes and nutrient levels and algae. So we'll talk about it a little bit more later. So for example, there's examples for declines in lake levels. Lac La Biche also had a declining lake level trend. It's actually insignificant, on the long term. This was by Richard Casey from AP. He did this analysis. And this was published in 2011, so it's a little older, but 2020 now we're up here. So we had a really longer time of shallower water in Lac La Biche, a little bit of a peak here in the late 90s, and now again a peak in 2020. Some of you may know about Muriell Lake. It's like this example of a drying lake. It's very shallow and it has lost a lot of water over the years. it got very saline as a result. It has had a lot of evaporation. So this is an example where evaporation is really important factor, and other factors, it's not as simple. And one of the reasons is that we have the watershed to lake area, right? It's like Skeleton Lake you mentioned is a very small watershed. And those lakes are very susceptible to these changes in lake levels because the evaporation, which is currently quite strong and which is increasing in Alberta, it plays such a big role and can drive it to lower lake levels. Whereas Lac La Biche is not that sensitive to that because it has a much bigger watershed, right? It's 17, so the area of a watershed is 17 times that of a lake. So there's a lot of surface where the precipitation can be collected and be brought into the lake. And relatively spoken, the loss by evaporation is quite minor. Whereas if you have a smaller watershed, the lake area gets just so much more important, and the losses become much more important versus the gains. So that explains a little bit why different lakes react differently in terms of lake level changes to drought and to rain as well. Okay, do I have another one? Yeah, so how can we build resilience? This is coming back. The hydrological cycle we have, there's up and downs. So if we have elements in the watershed that can actually store water and hold it back and release it when it's dry, then that's really beneficial. And again, that's the wetlands, that's the riparian areas. That's what you mentioned, Brian. You have wetlands that are close to the lake. Now it's rainy, they're going to be recharged, and if eventually it goes back down again, these wetlands will serve as a source of water to the lake, right? On our own properties, just to keep the vegetation healthy, it's good to have drought-resistant trees and lawns. Again, infiltrating the water helps. It's the same things because it recharges the groundwater, and if the groundwater storages are full, the lakes watersheds are more resilient to drought. And an interesting piece here, maybe for your reference, the Alberta Water Council has been working on drought resilience quite strongly. They still do. And I think they're just finalizing the reports. So very soon, I checked it out, it's not available yet, but it will very soon be available. So if you're interested in that, just go to their website and see we did some really good work. There's some really interesting. I just saw the drafts. It's just the final isn't released yet, but it's very interesting to. I'm sure there's much more on the social side as well, like how to be prepared, like how can municipalities be prepared and such. Is really good work that has been done. Now moving on to sunny and warm because it's a little bit related to drought. I want to focus a little bit more on the algae in this case because the sun and the warmth is really a factor that promotes algae growth. So the light, of course, algae need light to grow. Also temperature. So algae are promoted by light and by temperature, by warm temperatures. So if we have warm and sunny weather, which we had a lot in the early 2000s, that will promote the algae to grow. There's other things that are happening, such as nutrient release from sediments, but it's a really big piece as well. I could talk about just that in one talk, and I would love to, but just a little note that this is a really important factor in Alberta lakes. There are a lot of nutrients released back from the sediments and being available to algae for growth. And when it's warmer, these processes are faster. So it's happening more, there's more nutrients coming, helping the algae to grow. And then there's another thing like these stronger thermal layers. So when we have lots of sunlight and warmth, the upper layers warm and they kind of get separated from the lower, colder levels, layers where the sun doesn't get to. And it creates these like a borderline, like a density boundary. And that means the oxygen can't move anymore. And there's a few things that are happening. The oxygen in the lower levels can be depleted, and it's not good for fish. And in the upper layer, actually, there's blue-green algae really like these kinds of conditions when it's really stable and and stratified. So that has been shown. So it's something that promotes also more blue-green algae. So generally, it has been shown already across the world globally that there's more blue-green algae because the Earth is warming, and the predictions are going the same direction. And another direct effect of warmer temperatures are that it reduces the quality of habitat, fish habitat, right? Fish like it cold. So that is another effect we can see. How can we build lake resilience against sunny and warm? Again, it's something we like sunny and warm. We're happy it's there, but there's some things we can do. And again, there's things that come back. Vegetated lake shorelines and riverbanks are really good because we provide shade for cooler water and better fish habitat. Of course, on a scale like Lac La Biche, it's not going to make a big difference, right? But you do still have at least for the local shallow area where most of the fish hang out, it is a good thing. Excuse me. Other things that help to protect a little bit from the light and from the warmth are actually aquatic plants, especially the ones that have these big leaves like water lilies, things like that, and then also fallen trees. So things that are just kind of naturally near the shore, and they provide shade for cooler water and also better fish habitat. So that's a little bit something that we can leave in. I know some people, there's a little bit of a tendency of people just taking all the plants out, so it's easier just to swim there and have a nice beach or get in and out with a boat, which I fully understand. But I think there's things you can do. Maybe just have a little kind of a channel, right? You can go in and out, so it's for the boat. So there's little things I think we can do to do that. And another big thing, of course, because the warm and the sun, we can't do anything against it. The algae will be growing, will be blooming, but they always need both, right? We need both the sun, and they also need the nutrients. So that is even, more incentive or for us to work on the nutrients, to work on the nutrient inputs, to really understand where the nutrients are coming from. It's something it's something I like to promote and do, because when you actually understand the budget and even over the year in the spring versus the summer, where the nutrients are coming from, where they're fueling the algae, then you have a better understanding where to go to actually reduce these nutrient inputs. So yeah, any questions on all of that? Sun, drought, lakes.
Well, we did have a question from Daniel. I think it might be more related to the previous topic, but
Fine.
he had mentioned that the water inflow over the land is in Skeleton Lake, I'm assuming, is mostly peatlands, bogs, and fens that purify phosphorus. The
Yes.
inflows are tea-colored, filled with tannins, and therefore likely more acidic. He says he believes it would be less in phosphate load because of the chemistry. There's not a lot of agricultural runoff, and human loads are much less than historical. And he says he's wondering if you could comment on the idea of hoping that it means a better balance in what has been different types, or what has been a concentration of chemistry. So I'm thinking like different, a better balance in the chemistry of the lake.
That's a good question. I mean, some lakes are naturally, because we have a lot of wetlands around them, they are more brown tea colored and are more acidic and have a certain chemistry. So it's difficult to comment on that, saying it's better or worse, right? Some lakes are naturally one way and some are naturally another way. It is definitely true that wetlands are filtering nutrients and other things off the water that's coming from the landscape. So that is definitely true. We do know, interesting side fact, that colored, like these tea-colored lakes or tea-colored water, it does actually contain quite a bit of phosphorus as well, but it is more bound in a different way, like there's these complexes, these colored substances. So it's not necessarily available to algae. It'll also decrease the light availability, so which means it will also maybe reduce a little bit what can go on with algae growth. So Yeah, it's I wouldn't just say it's a better chemistry, but just by the way that you have wetlands and that they're working in your watershed and they're they shouldn't be drained. I didn't really quite get how much the water was encouraged to go in the lake. It's good that it's in the watershed. Of course, you don't want to drain wetlands either, right? Because then you will lose the water forever and it won't come back. It's just like a short-term benefit. So definitely want to make sure that these wetlands are functioning and they're keeping the hydrological balance to be able to have that function of sponges and keeping the water for the lake when it needs it most, right? Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. I did have one question of my own, and that was when we have warm weather, does that favor any particular group of algae over other groups of algae?
Yeah, definitely. So we do have, it's already, you can already see it naturally in lakes seasonally, and when it's cooler in spring, we have more of the diatoms and like the golden algae. And then in summer, when it's warmer, it promotes the green and the blue-green algae. It is just the blue-green algae really like it hot. Like they're really the ones that are mostly, so when it's going to a certain level, they will, like the warmer it is, the more they will dominate. And it has also something to do because they're quite a few of them have these they're buoyant. We can self-regulate the buoyancy. We have these cells that just contain gases, and we can kind of, make more and less. So we can actually go up and down the water column and really look for the place that's really ideal for light. Some algae, we can't do that, and it's just too hot and too light. These algae, we can go up and down. We can really regulate. So they really outcompete other algae when it's really stable and warm and calm. So yeah, so those are the ones that you will find when it's warm.
I have a question. So we sample the lake every year throughout the summer. Can you hear me all okay?
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. Okay, so we sample the lake every year, and this is actually one of the first years that we found a thermocline in the lake. That it's always been very mixed, right?
Which lake are you talking about?
About Lac La Biche.
Okay.
Yeah, so generally it's always the same temperature from pretty well the top to the bottom in the summertime. And this year it's the same, and then you hit that thermocline where it's at least a 2-degree temperature difference. And this is the first year that I've noticed in a while that we've actually had that. And I'm not sure, maybe the rain and I guess all that, but I am also curious too about your slides you had before that you said was stratified lake will generally have more algae. I just think that when I was thinking when a lake mixes, the bottom of the lake would then bring up all the nutrients from the bottom of the lake. So I'm just hoping you can, I don't know, elaborate a little bit more. Or...
Yeah, no, yeah, that's not a generalization for sure. Like in terms of the stratified lakes or the mixed lakes in Alberta, generally the mixed lakes have more algae. So that's I guess it's when it's so stable. I think it's more a lake that's already stratified. If the stratification is even stronger and longer duration during the year, then it's better for the algae. So if you have that switch, though, that's kind of interesting. Alberta lakes, quite a few of them are shallow enough or big enough, like the Biche, I guess, to be mixed. They have, the constant supply of nutrients. So they have, like Moose Lake as well. There's often quite a bit of algae blooms. Now, for Lac La Biche, that's an interesting fact. It probably has to do with the increased depth. Then you might have just hit like a threshold where it's so deep that the sun just is not strong enough to mix the whole water column anymore, and it's setting up that stratification this year. That's really cool. I'm curious to look at that. Yeah.
And then another thing too is we generally have really bad algae right now, and Moose, like you mentioned before too. I've heard that they've already got really bad algae, but this year, I know there's been algae, but definitely not how it has been in the past. So think the
Very
rain definitely
interesting.
helped us this year. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, there might be two things, right? That the water flushes through more quickly, although it's a big lake, so that's probably not the case. You probably still have a lot of nutrients in there. But the stabilizing factor, that might be a big one. Because as I said, this internal nutrient cycling from the sediments is often quite strong. And if when you're setting up this thermal acidification, the phosphorus that gets released from the sediments can't get to the top where the algae are, right? Because there's this density boundary. It just can't move, or just very slowly. So yeah, that might be the case. Are you scheduled for ALMS Lake Watch sampling this year?
Well, yeah, we do our own lake sampling every year, but actually we're going to partner with them this year. So I've got Caleb coming out this summer sometime to come sampling with me, and we're going to partner with them on the water milfoil sampling and the beach water sampling. So yeah, it's going to be good.
That's great.
I'm partnering with Kristen Anderson too, with, you know,
she's my colleague.
Yes. Yeah, so we're doing the wetland replacement program in Lac La Biche County this year. So it's exciting.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Yeah, she's doing a few of his projects across the different places. So we're all very excited about that. Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment that I guess again reinforces something you mentioned, but I have an appreciation for what you mentioned about aquatic vegetation. Something that I've noticed from having lived here and having been working on watershed stuff for a number of years, I've gotten to, my radar is well tuned to healthy riparian areas versus not healthy. So I appreciate what you were saying about close to shore vegetation there helps to provide shade. In the past, I've always thought of that as being vegetation that's onshore, but from your presentation, it reminded me, you know, there's lots of times when I've been out canoeing, say at the lakes out at Lakeland, or even I see it on the shores of Lac La Biche, and I see those reed beds. And it just occurred to me now, I never think that they really do much, but they probably, you know, en masse, when there's a whole bunch of them, then that provides a bit of shade for fish species in that shoreline area as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I guess now I've kind of learned that, to have a new appreciation for that. That also becomes a part of that healthy riparian or littoral. Is that the right word? Littoral zone?
Littoral zone, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. So that's something that I learned already.
Mm-hmm. Great.
From tonight.
Excellent. We can move on if you're ready.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right.
Time goes by quick, but we're more than halfway through, I think. Wind. So yeah, we'll go through this a little bit quicker. It's just like an interesting piece that the wind makes also a big difference for what's happening. So we just talked about mixing. So if there's strong winds, or if there's an opportunity to mix, if we have nutrients and algae, everything gets mixed, and keeps the algae well fed, I guess. There's other things that are happening, right? It creates waves that you know about on the shores. It creates currents, which I'm going to show shortly. And then we have calm weather that will promote this layering of the water and certain blue-green algae as well. And again, talked about the subtleties of that in different lake types. But I always find interesting, and I think that's what people might not be so aware, is that there's in many lakes, Lac La Biche is definitely large enough to have currents. So many lakes have currents created by just a constant wind on the lake. So sometimes it's just during the day, but if you have longer periods of time, you can have currents that persist quite a while. And you know, so water moves around in the lake. It's not just like the water that's in front of, you know, your maybe property. It's not always the same water. It will move around. It will mix just depending on how the wind goes. And this is just an example here for Lake Superior. Of course, that's a huge lake. It almost acts like a little sea, inland sea, right? So there's, of course, there's much stronger and persistent currents there. But on a small scale, we find those too. So sometimes you find algae blooms move around, where there's then one corner, then another corner. it's definitely by the wind, but these currents can even transport more of those algae as well and push them in a certain direction. So it's kind of an interesting tidbit. What can we do with resilience? Again, the tall trees around the shoreline might help to reduce wind effects. Of course, that's more for small lakes and ponds, right? So Lac La Biche won't make a difference because it's such a large lake. But vegetated shorelines, again, are protection against different things from waves. Winds can also quite exceptionally push ice on the shore. I found this really interesting. Pigeon Lake in 2016, I think it was, had these huge pieces of ice coming on the shore. So yeah, what can we do? This is quite extreme, of course. It doesn't happen all the time, but yeah, the more vegetation you have, it'll hold back and protect your lake shore a little bit from the damages that you could incur, including properties, right? What people's properties. Snow and ice, just a little thing. That's actually something we're at ALMS, you know, on the board of the Alberta Lake Management Society, and we have a speaker series coming up as well. Like, it's a little plug for to replace our ALMS workshop that we usually have every year. And we actually just invited someone who's a specialist in winter limnology. So you'll learn more about, if you attend that, you'll learn about what's going on under the ice. Often, historically, we focus a lot on what's going on in summer because that's where we actually use the lake. But there's lots of things going on in winter. Ice cover is cutting the connection to the atmosphere. So often there's low oxygen in shallow lakes or lakes with lots of aquatic vegetation. It's a quite natural phenomenon. You can have low oxygen there because of decaying plants. With the bacterial breakdown, just eats up all the oxygen, and it can result even into creation of methane or sulphides with foul odors. You might know them from these smaller wetlands or smaller ponds or dugouts or something. And this is a very natural phenomenon. I've seen it in the Piece of Delta. It's so untouched. It's quite natural. But it also can get stronger due to eutrophication, which we talked about earlier, nutrient enrichment, more growth of algae and aquatic vegetation, and more organic sediments will all promote this. So there's certain things that might tip a lake over the threshold. I know that Dried Meat Lake, for example, south of Camrose is quite bad for that, and it has had a lot of eutrophication because a lot of impacts in that watershed. So and yeah, there's just of course in winter there's less light and there's less temperature, so everything is slower, but there's still a lot of life. So I've just looked at this one paper here, and our speaker there, she's a co-author on this paper, that there's still a lot of algae growing. There's 15% to 25% of a biovolume. So it's all happy and growing. It's just not as much, but it's not just that things are stopping when the ice comes on, and so things that might have happened for the year before might still influence the year after as well. You have kind of a certain, we call it inoculum. It's like a little, seed bank that will come back up right away in spring when conditions are right. It never quite starts from zero. Yeah, so excessive algae and vegetation can be reduced through nutrient reduction, and this might have potential to improve oxygen and also reduce these methane and sulphide occurrences. Sulphide is quite toxic to aquatic life, so I don't know if you have seen that. Oh, this is now a picture. I wanted to show you actually the video. Let's see. One thing that can happen is that there's so much methane, you can actually light it on fire. So some researchers have done that. I'm just going to go right to that place here. I thought it was quite interesting. I've never done it myself. It's not a safe practice for sure, but I'm just going to try and get that on here. Can you see the video? Yeah. So these are the bubbles of methane. Yeah, sorry you don't have a sound, but maybe Oh, there you go. just thought it was kind of interesting.
It's very cool.
I think I'd use a longer stick on my
Yeah, I
match.
know. It's not the... Okay, I'm just gonna try and stop this here. Yeah. Ugh. Right, next. Doesn't let me go next. I have to just check if I can. Oh yeah, there we go. Questions on wind, snow, ice until we go to future changes.
Yeah, I do have a question about that study you had mentioned. So is it that it decreases 15 to 25%, or it decreases to 15 to 25%?
Yeah, it is on average 15% of what's in summer. What's there in summer, so it is quite a bit lower, but it is still present. So I guess it's just an interesting thing to know, and the paper really also outlines that we just don't know that much. So there's a focus now on trying to fill some of its gaps, because we know that with the warming trends we see with climate change, there's going to be less. We already see that less snow cover and less ice cover on lakes. So it'll change the whole ecology, right? It'll shorten that winter period and have more summer or spring conditions. So, yeah.
Yeah, because we've done quite a bit of winter sampling with our students, and I know when we take those water samples out, we have a hard time finding anything in them besides zooplankton. So that's interesting.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was a global study that on average, kind of on the ice, also in northern temperate areas, or I think there's also Arctic. So it's really an average. So I think it depends on where you are. Maybe in Canada, if you're more in the north and there's a lot of snow, maybe it's lower. Maybe if you're more in the south, it might depend on the quality too. Yeah. To be, maybe you have to attend that webinar and ask a question to the expert. I'm not the expert on that one.
We're actually having a thunderstorm in Lac La Biche right now, or at least I am. Yeah, that's kind of appropriate. Any other questions here? Jillian.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, sometimes when it's really windy, you see foamy, looks like soap suds along the lake. Can you give me a little more information about the cause and the impacts of that, please?
Yeah, it's a quite natural occurrence. I believe it had something to do with algae, but it is really, yeah, like you think it's like soap, so there's some material in the water that helps to foam, but it's quite natural. So it can be due to algae proteins, and there's substances in algae that will make it more foamy. Like you can also see it when it's not windy in certain areas. Foam can build like this. So I don't have the exact answer, but if you're really interested, I can look into this a little bit more. All I know that people always like, oh, this looks really bad because it looks like soap, right? But it's quite natural. So it's just kind of a way how things get mixed up, and it can be just developing like that due to the rain and the waves. Not the rain, the wind and the waves. But if you'd like, I can look into this more. I haven't really. I'm not sure how well known it is actually either, but I do know that it's a natural occurrence.
Fair enough. I just was curious a little bit more about it, but that's just fine.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll move on. It's already 8 o'clock. So how will weather change? Of course, the weather from day to day might not feel that much like it's changing, because we have these ups and downs, right? So, but really, the climate change predictions that I've put in here, those are for the short term. So there's also projections for the long term. I put in the short term from the 2020s to 2050, and I've I've contrasted August and so for precipitation, I contrasted April and August to show a little bit how seasonally different it can be. So if you really look for Lac La Biche, it's right in there. For April, it looks quite blue, so there will be more precipitation. But then if you look in August, it's quite brown, so there will be, it's more like in the whitish area. So there's going to be no change in precipitation for August. But overall, the predictions in the Athabasca area, though, in the Athabasca Basin, is that it's going to be wetter. There's like more precipitation in the year, but it is also going to be warmer. So that speaks again to our topic about the lakes. There's more water coming in, but there's also more water going out through evaporation. On the right, the temperature here, I've contrasted. I've just looked at August because really in August is that, like the summer is when the algae are growing, that would care about the temperature. And here's the short-term predictions on the top and the long-term predictions on the bottom. And we can see that on the short term, Lac La Biche is kind of in a border there between like around 2. So 2 to maybe a little bit more than 2 degrees Celsius up to 2050. And that's on average, right? And then later and farther in the future, we have, actually I'm seeing here, I'm using it's a different scenario, but it just shows that it's going to be more changes up to 3 degrees, 3 to 4 degrees further in the future. And this is an average, so we will see just normal summers and such. But what really is happening probably is that we're going to have more extremes in terms of the really hot years we haven't had before. Really, the major temperature changes are happening in winter. I didn't post time here because we might not make that a big difference to the lakes we know up here, because we'll still have winter and ice. But those are kind of the predictions. For climate, how will it impact lakes? So this is where it gets complicated. So so I put up here a thing that is a little bit similar to the graph I showed earlier in terms of moisture and the balance between precipitation and evaporation. It's a moisture index, and it shows a little bit how this moisture index will change in the future. So we see if it's getting more into the red, it's going to get drier, and if it's going to more the blue, it's getting wetter. And if you look at Lac La Biche, seems to be in between the yellow and the green, so kind of maybe no change to maybe a little bit drier. Only in the really long term, it looks like the drying trend that is really quite strong in the south will kind of move north and will be more obvious also in this area. So these are kind of the predictions that climate models, it's very complex. Even these models have always been good in predicting temperature. Precipitation has always been a little bit weaker, and so the science is evolving on how to actually predict changes in moisture and what it means for flows and rivers and also for lakes. So the science is still evolving, but I'm just putting some things out here that from knowing the hydrology of different lakes, what it will mean. So the higher temperatures are definitely promoting more algae all across different lake types. But in terms of the moisture and how it kind of works on lake levels, that's a little bit more complex, right? So we have more shallow lakes will probably be more susceptible to drying with the small watersheds, if we've seen Skeleton and Muriell. Okay, I'm back. Deep lakes and lakes with large watersheds like Lac La Biche might have more nutrients, but also might have better flushing, so better put through of water, which helps to reduce algae. So there's many factors that are going to, to more and less algae. And now on top of that, we're adding the complexity that you just said, but maybe there's stratification building up. So that might actually reduce any inputs from the sediments. So it's quite complex. So every single individual lake, really in theory, to really know what's going to be happening in the future, you'll probably need a model, and it's quite complex analysis to really figure it out, unless it's a really clear-cut example like Muriell Lake, right? So yeah, so this is probably what we'll see. Take-home messages, you probably already noticed there's good practices, but many of you already know for lake health and watershed health that are really effective at actually making the lake more resilient to all kinds of impacts of changes in weather, and especially also extreme weather. And those are the healthy and vegetated shorelines and riverbanks and watershed, wetlands, preserving and restoring wetlands. In terms of development, urban areas or properties, low impact development, which includes all of the principles of infiltration and lower fertilizer use and etc. There's a lot of literature about that, and to reducing the nutrient inputs in general, because we do know that algae will have it easier in the future. So we have to make it harder for them by cutting off the nutrients if we can, right? So yeah, so these are the things that I had prepared, but I'm happy to have more discussions, more questions.